here. So I'm going to go over today's activity, which you guys are going to be doing in class today, but I'm also going to walk you guys through a high scoring paper one so you guys can see some examples, because what you're doing today is you're writing the paper one that we started last week. So let me share my screen so we can go over the high scoring paper one. All right, so this is the same prompt from last week that we saw the high scoring candidates introduction for. So we are going to go through the rest of the paper very briefly. I'm not going to go through super detailed. I'm just going to hit the high level overviews so you guys can see the important parts. And then then you'll get a chance to write it with your prompts. Remember, the prompt for this one was along the lines of how poetry can help arrogant men see the falter of their ways, something along those lines. So the introduction, we said it was brief last week. There's a little too brief. It wasn't, so your introduction doesn't have to be super long. It shouldn't be super detailed with all the key points you're going to put in there, but it should have at least the reasons you're going to go over for your claim, or for whatever you're discussing. So the introduction is just a reminder, poetry can be very useful to many people. John F. Kennedy once said, "When power leads man toward arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations." I agree with this quote to a very far extent, because poetry teaches many different lessons to people that can help reveal that one human only has so much power. Poetry is capable of teaching lessons to people that let them know that they have limits when they get too arrogant. So what the person did well in their introduction, again, was restate what the question was about, made sure they talked about what the question is asking, but they didn't go over the reasons why they can look at both sides. So that was something they should have added in there. You should have that in your introduction. So it's brief, but it's not that brief. Okay, so now you're going to focus on your body paragraphs today and your conclusion, because remember, the prompt you're working on is discursive, and if you recall, discursive writing requires you to put your conclusion only at the end, not in the beginning. So don't pick a side yet. Pick a side at the end of your essay in the concluding paragraph. So this person broke their paragraphs down by just doing one paragraph per side, which made it very easy for them organizationally, and then they concluded with their concluding paragraphs. So starting off, John F. Kennedy's quote, "When power leads man towards arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations," is true to a far extent, because poetry teaches lessons that show situations that remind people that they're only human. They're in Robert Frost's poem sorry, I'm trying to read the handwriting. Frost teaches people that life can end so abruptly. Notice also, while they're writing, they make mistakes. They just put one line through it and they keep going. So you do the same thing on yours, because remember, you're writing in pen. The husband and wife had lost a child together, and the husband had to bury the child. The husband was seemingly unbothered, but made a statement about a few rainy days, noting the best fences can make someone can make. This symbolizes life, because Frost had been talking about something simple, easily ending a life. Life can so easily be torn away by something as small as a rainy day. The poem reminds those that power doesn't mean much, because it's easy to be alive one second and dead the next. Poetry, such as Robert Frost's, can show people that they aren't necessarily better because they have limits and their life has limits. Since poetry can teach lessons such as life ends quickly to humble those of arrogance, I agree with Kennedy's quote to a very far extent. So, they noticed they picked their side in their body paragraph. Technically not inaccurate, but it is better to do that at the end, so it doesn't show that you're biased throughout your essay. You pick the conclusion at the end. But they gave an example with Robert Frost's poem, and they talked about how the poem teaches us that everyone kind of is on the same level, because we're all human, and in the end, every human dies. It's the human condition, as upsetting as that might be. It is a sheer fact, and so they use that as the driving force behind this one, because Robert Frost's poem talks about the quickness of life, how life can end abruptly, and how there is no guarantee of the next day. And so that can help rein in the arrogance. And so notice they explain that. They use their voice to explain how Robert Frost's poem relates to their claim that it does help arrogant men, but they used the Robert Frost poem as their evidence. So that was a good body paragraph. Next, some may argue that poetry does not remind arrogant men with power of his limitations because poetry is often unrealistic. If a situation in poetry is unrealistic, it can't be taken seriously. Fictional poetry can't remind people of the limitations if the poetry is not a situation that can actually occur. If poetry is fictional and the occurrence in the poem can't physically happen, reword it would, sorry, remind people of limitations because it may not be our type of limitation. When power leads to arrogance, poetry can't help because people will only see it as childish and fake and won't listen to any morals because they don't see the situation as possible and they don't relate themselves to it. Therefore, John F. Kennedy's quote is not true. So that was their counterclaim, showing the opposite side. Lots of their voice, not an invalid reason. Something they're missing is the evidence, right? It would be great if they had a poem that was childish. Maybe they could have brought into play Dr. Seuss, who wrote in poems, and that could have helped to elaborate on their point that poetry can be seen childish to some and thus not be taken seriously. They didn't do that, so that's a little bit of point value lost there. Um, so it says here it needs exemplars, and but they also it was well written, so they had their voice in there, they had reasons, so they did get some points, but again, you want examples, and so that's where they lost their points. So they gave their claim, right? So intro, they did a claim paragraph, a counterclaim paragraph, and now they're going to loop it back to their overall claim paragraph, and then they'll conclude. However, this isn't the case because whether poetry is realistic or not, the lessons can be transferred to real life to remind arrogant humans of their limitations. In Paradise Lost, John Milton's poem, Lucifer had gotten cast to hell. I think that's what it says, for leading a rebellion against God. Lucifer got tired of serving in heaven and decided he was going to lead a group of rebel angels against God. Lucifer had been arrogant because he held a form of power in heaven since he had been God's favorite angel. Lucifer ended up losing against God and was away to hell. Lucifer even said, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, which shows Lucifer had power in hell and that he was arrogant, since he thought he was better in hell than those in heaven. This situation is unrealistic because someone can't be physically thrown to hell. It's impossible for this to ever actually happen to a person because no one can lead angels against God on earth. Despite the situation being unrealistic, the poem still reminds arrogant men driven by power of their limitations because the lessons within it. The poem teaches that people acting accordingly due to arrogance will have to live with serious consequences for the rest of their life. The poem reminds people that there are limits to their actions and they may end up with their own form of hell. So I agree with Kennedy's quote. When power leads men towards arrogance, poetry reminds them of his limitations to a very far extent. So again, they brought it back to their claim and they used another example in there. So clearly they have a side because they put examples on their side only. That's why their counterclaim paragraph wasn't that great, but they did have two tangible examples in there, which did help to support their side. And then they conclude with poetry can teach many lessons about limits of life. When power leads to arrogance, poetry shows them that they have limits in life, realistic or not. Poems can teach themes to show limits. So I agree with John F. Kennedy's quote, when power leads towards arrogance, poetry reminds them of limitations to a far extent. Brought it back in, show what the argument is. A couple things that the reader noted when they graded this one is that they did lack a lot of evidence. So they did need at least one more quote or one more piece of evidence in the counterclaim paragraph rather. So that's where they did lose some points there. But overall, it was a high scoring paper, getting a 21 out of 30. Could have gotten more points with more examples, but they used their own voice and they definitely had a strong argument and they somewhat showed both sides. So make sure in yours, let's bring it back together real fast. Make sure that in your essay, you're showing both sides. Don't do what they did and state your claim in the second paragraph. Wait until the conclusion because it is discursive writing. I think theirs was to a far extent, or a to what extent question. So they had a little bit of ambiguity in that, but yours is discursive because it is asking that science has caused more problems than it has solved. Discuss. So don't come to a conclusion to the very end, but do show both sides of that argument with as many examples as you can include. Yeah, I think that's all the points I have to make. So I'm going to post this essay for you guys to review as well. You'll have a few minutes to review the high-scoring essay so you can see what they did, and then you're going to write your essay today and finish it tomorrow. Ready, set,